You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium, available on Apple Podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about the disappearance of Glen and Bessie Hyde. So it's over to you now, Mark.
Glen and Bessie Hyde were newlyweds who, back in 1928, whilst attempting to run the rapids of the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon in Arizona, they suddenly disappeared. If the couple had prevailed this undertaking in advance, Bessie Hyde would have succeeded in being the first woman known to accomplish this feat. The couple were last seen on the 18th of November in 1928, and eventually their scow, or their small barge, was found around 3 weeks later in the early December, floating upright around River Mile 237, filled with both their belongings and their supplies that were all completely strapped in securely. However, both Glen and Bessie Hyde were nowhere to be seen. Glen Hyde's father, Rafe Hyde, aged 70, hired a group of men to search the Grand Canyon within the area that he thought Glen and Bessie were likely to travel. But after 41 days of continual searching, they had no success. And since the couple's disappearance, no one knows exactly what happened out there on that river in the Grand Canyon. And to this day, the disappearance of Glen and Bessie Hyde still remains a mystery. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in again and listening to this Disappearing in the Wilderness episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a psychic medium, a ufologist and a true crime buff who every day, when he looks at himself in the mirror, says to himself, time may be a great healer, but it's a lousy beautician. But just to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every week, usually on a Tuesday night, though occasionally on a Wednesday allowing for bank holidays and busy weekends, I do a podcast on the many wide and various subjects that fall under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters, and all sorts of other paranormal phenomena, including true crime, unsolved crime, serial killers, the darker side of some past celebrities, and the occasional missing person that often goes unnoticed. So, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review or an opinion of this episode's subject that I can reply to, a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell. Or, if you are listening on any other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about this missing people story surrounding the disappearance of Glen and Bessie Hyde. And this week's necessary disclaimer: this story is a tale that sadly involves people disappearing through misadventure, so may prove upsetting to some. You listen at your own discretion. Also, all opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts of the case remain. I also apologise if I pronounce anything incorrectly. My English, although it is my first and only language, has helped me to realise that teamwork is very important. After all, it does help if you can put the blame on someone else. So, back we go to the story. Well, according to Wikipedia, the Colorado River is one of the principal rivers in the southwestern United States and northern Mexico, and stretches at 1,450 miles or 2,330 kilometres, and is one of the longest rivers in the United States, coming in at 5th position. The name Colorado itself derives from the Spanish language and translates to coloured reddish, which is due to its heavy silt or granular material load. It starts in the central Rocky Mountains of Colorado, and then it flows generally southwest across the Colorado Plateau and through the Grand Canyon before reaching Lake Mead on the Arizona-Nevada border, where it then turns south towards the international border, and after entering Mexico, it then approaches the mostly dry Colorado River Delta at the tip of the Gulf of California between Baja and Sonora. Large-scale river management began in the early 1900s with major guidelines established in a series of international and US interstate treaties known as the Law of the River, with the US federal government constructing most of the major dams and aqueducts between 1910 and 1970. And again, according to Wikipedia, the Grand Canyon itself is a steep-sided canyon carved by the aforementioned Colorado River in Arizona in the United States, proudly taking up an area of 277 miles or 446 kilometres long, 18 miles or 29 kilometres wide, and attains a depth of just over a mile. For thousands of years, the area has been continuously inhabited by Native Americans who have built many settlements within the canyon and in many of its caves, with the Pueblo people considering the Grand Canyon a holy site, making regular pilgrimages to it. Between the mid-1800s and 2015, there have been a total of 770 recorded deaths that have happened in the Grand Canyon, with most of these fatalities occurring between the years of 1869 to 2001 being air disasters, meaning of course both airplane and helicopter crashes. In fact, me being the morbid person that I am, I did actually manage to get some death rate statistics for the Grand Canyon. Starting with 242 deaths in air disasters, however I should point out that 128 of them are from the 1956 Grand Canyon mid-air collision. 53 deaths resulted from falls, 65 deaths were attributed to environmental causes, including things like heart stroke, cardiac arrest, dehydration and hypothermia. 7 deaths were caused by people getting caught in flash floods, 79 people were drowned in the Colorado River, 25 in freak errors and accidents, including things like lightning strikes and rock falls, and finally 23 deaths were the victims of homicides. I feel I should point out here that nearly all of the deaths that occurred in the Grand Canyon were preventable. Glen Hyde, who was born on the 9th of December in 1898, was a farmer from Twin Falls in Idaho. And Bessie Louise Haley, who was born on the 29th of December in 1905, was a divorcee originally from Parkersburg in West Virginia. Glen Hyde was considered, by the most people that knew him, as an expert boat builder who not only built a 20-foot-long wooden sweep scow, but also had plenty of rafting experience on the Salmon and Snake Rivers in Idaho a few years earlier. On an interesting side note here, a scow is a smaller type of barge, with some scows also being rigged to be used for sailing. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, scows carried cargo in coastal waters and inland waterways due to them having the advantage of navigating shallow water or small harbours. Scows were common use in the American Great Lakes and other parts of the US, Canada, southern England and New Zealand. In modern times, their main purpose is for recreational use and racing. However, today there are still garbage scows that are used for aquatic transport of refuse. Bessie Hyde, in comparison to her husband, was a total novice when it came to the rivers and rapids, but was an aspiring artist who could be described as bohemian, meaning that she often embraced a lifestyle that valued creativity, free-spiritedness and a disregard for materialism. The couple first met in 1927 on a passenger ship that was travelling to Los Angeles, with them eventually getting married on the 12th of April in 1928, although some records state that it was the 10th of April in 1928, but hey-ho. However, whatever the date, it was the following day after Bessie's divorce. After this first short break, in part 2 we will look at the preparation that both Glen and Bessie made for their upcoming trip and their sudden disappearance.
This show is brought to you courtesy of Neil Packer and the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre. Find them online at www.hauntedresearchcentre.com or at 9 to 11 Regent Street, Hinckley, LE10 1AW. Open on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for guided tours of the haunted rooms at just £3 per person. Booking is essential at all times, and over 16s only, please, unless accompanied by an adult. The haunted rooms are extremely haunted, and paranormal activity could and has taken place at any time. Some areas and particular objects or items can be quite scary and unnerving. Membership is available for £25 to qualify for selective offers. And why not download the app, available on both iOS and Android, for only $3.99, to keep up to date with what is coming up at the centre.
Glen Hyde was determined to set a new speed record for a trip through the Grand Canyon, and he wanted his wife, Bessie, to make history as the first documented woman to run the trip. And, according to the late Otis Doc Marston Library, after the couple planned to run the canyon, they then wanted to go on the lecture circuit and earn an income by retelling their story. It all started on the 20th of October in 1928 in the city of Green River in Utah, and both Glen and Bessie Hyde started their adventure. They had already made a successful run through many of the major rapids along the Green and Colorado rivers, and they estimated it would take them no more than a month and a half to complete their journey. On the 16th of November that same year, and almost a month into their trip, they then spent a few days restocking with supplies at the Grand Canyon village on the South Rim, and during this time they both had an interview with a news reporter from the Denver Post, with the assumption that their final destination, which was the Needles in California, only being a few weeks away. They then hiked along the Bright Angel Trail of the Grand Canyon, and there they met the brothers Ellsworth and Emery Kolb, who were famous photographers who ran a cliffside studio. Upon noticing the studio, Glen and Bessie Hyde then decided it would be a nice idea if they went and introduced themselves to the Kolb brothers and explained to them that they were honeymooners who had been boating on the river for the last 26 days. On an interesting side note here, Ellsworth and Emery Kolb, or otherwise known as the Kolb brothers, were best known for their photography and filming of the Grand Canyon in the early to mid-1900s and have become important characters in documenting the canyon's history. Originally from Pennsylvania, Ellsworth Kolb was a steel mill labourer who was born in 1876, and his younger brother Emery, an electrician, was born 5 years later in 1881. In 1900, following an injury at work, Ellsworth headed west to Colorado, and whilst there, he worked a variety of different jobs until he ended up working at the Bright Angel Hotel near the Grand Canyon. Ellsworth then, in 1902, sent a letter to his brother, Emery, who had by now taken up photography, appealing for him to come and see the beauty of the West for himself, and in 1911 the brothers took a 3-month-long river journey to capture the river rapids on film. 3 years later, the brothers had found notoriety from the National Geographic Society for their artistic contribution on film, and when the Grand Canyon was officially named a national park, Emery Kolb was given a contract to continue the operation of a photography studio on the Bright Angel Trail, with the contract being renewed every decade. At a later date, the Kolb brothers reported that both Glen and Bessie Hyde had asked to have their photo taken on the canyon rim, and that they would return at a later date to retrieve the photograph once the trip was completed. And according to Emery Kolb, Glen Hyde also told him that they did not have any life preservers between them, which prompted a warning from Emery. However, Glen Hyde responded to him by just laughing. But Emery Kolb, not being put off by Glen Hyde's carefree position, offered them a couple of life preservers, which they then both refused, whilst claiming that they could swim anything. Emery Kolb also added that Bessie Hyde did look nervous about the remaining part of their journey ahead, and as Glen and Bessie Hyde prepared to depart and walk down the Bright Angel Trail to their boat, Emery Kolb's daughter, Emily Kolb, appeared on the scene all dressed up nicely, with Bessie Hyde remarking as she looked at her, and I quote,
"I wonder if I shall ever wear pretty shoes again."
It was also reported at a later date that various other people who encountered Glen and Bessie Hyde during their layover at the Grand Canyon village claim that Bessie just wanted to leave their excursion and go home. Another piece of information that was brought to the authorities is that it is said a man named Adolf G. Sutro accompanied Glen and Bessie Hyde back to the canyon whilst he was taking photographs of the area, and even accompanied them for a short distance on their boat. This Sutro reference regarding him accompanying the Hydes is mentioned specifically in the Ken Burns PBS documentary series called National Parks, America's Best Idea. And if this story is true, then this Adolf G. Sutro was likely to be the last person to see the Hydes alive. I have tried to find some more information regarding this Adolf G. Sutro, as I do try to be thorough with my shows. However, unfortunately, there isn't much available to me, either online or in my vast library of unexplained books, so we'll just have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Glen and Bessie Hyde had not been heard from since the early part of December in 1928. So, as a result, Emery Kolb, who, if you remember, was one of the Kolb brothers, initiated a search of the area, which included using a small plane that flew through the inner gorge of the canyon. Inner gorges are, of course, what forms at the interface between the hill slopes and river channels. On the 20th of December, the pilot of the search plane finally saw Glen and Bessie Hyde's intact boat, which was caught in the rocks on the river some 15 miles south of Diamond Creek. So the rescue party, assuming that where there is a boat there must be a survivor, figured that the Hydes were somewhere in the canyon waiting on a ledge to be found after missing for 21 days. And when the rescue party finally reached the completely intact boat, they found in it food, clothing, gun, books, Bessie's journal, which was all still neatly strapped in, along with a camera which revealed the final photo to have been shot near River Mile 165 on or about the 27th of November. However, there was no sign of Glen or Bessie Hyde. The last entry in Bessie Hyde's journal, which was entered on the 30th of November when they were near Diamond Creek, indicated that they had made camp near mile 226 and had conquered mile 231 rapid. But there was no hint in her journal of anything being amiss. On an interesting side note here, a river mile is a measure of distance in miles along a river from its mouth, with river mile numbers beginning at 0 and increasing as they go further upstream. They are analogues to vehicle roadway mile markers, except that river miles are rarely marked on a physical river, and instead they are marked on navigational charts and topographic maps. The river mile is not the same as the length of the river, rather it is a means of locating any feature along the stretch of water that is relative to its distance from the mouth. The corresponding metric unit using kilometres is, believe it or not, called river kilometres. Glen Hyde's father, Raith Hyde, aged 70, then hired a group of men to help search the Grand Canyon within the zone that he thought Glen and Bessie were most likely to have travelled to within the Diamond Creek area, even enlisting both of the Kolb brothers to help. However, after 41 days of continual searching, they had no success in finding the couple. After this second short break, in part 3 we will look at the continual search, what authorities turned up during their investigation, and some of the theories as to what may have happened to Glen and Bessie Hyde.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future? They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights Ghost Hunting Events. Remember, only the original will do.
Search and rescue teams backtracked all the way from River Mile 237 to Diamond Creek in order to find the missing couple, spending more than a month combing the canyons, but found nothing. So, by all appearances, Glen and Bessie Hyde had simply vanished, leaving us with the question of what did actually happen to the missing couple. Well, over the years, various bits of beauty parlour chit-chat and whispers would start to unwind and rumour control would go into overdrive, and the stories around Glen and Bessie Hyde's disappearance would be enough to fill a 1970s British daytime soap. Some friends of a woman named Georgie White Clark, who gained fame for her rafting adventures in the Grand Canyon, speculated that she herself was indeed Bessie Hyde, with a potential link between Georgie and Bessie starting when, following Georgie Clark's death in 1992, her friends started to look through her personal items. And upon looking through Georgie Clark's personal effects, her friends learned that her birth certificate indicated that her real name was actually Bessie D. Ross. However, Georgie Clark's friends' curiosity was piqued even further when they found the marriage licence of Glen and Bessie Hyde at her home and a pistol in her lingerie drawer. A Colorado River historian named Brad Dimmock, whose book Sunk Without a Sound, the tragic Colorado River honeymoon of Glen and Bessie Hyde, which investigated the couple's story and the subsequent theories, examined the items from the now deceased Georgie Clark's home and concluded from the photographs that Georgie White Clark and Bessie Hyde were not the same person, concluding that the two women didn't even resemble each other, and that it's more than likely that these items at her home, meaning the marriage licence of Glen and Bessie Hyde, the photographs and the pistol, of course, were more than likely just souvenirs. And on an interesting side note, Georgie White Clark, who, as you now know, was born Bessie D. Ross, was the first woman to become a commercial river runner in the Grand Canyon. She is also known as the woman who changed the pace of river running by opting to use rubber army surplus rafts and tying groups of 3 of them together to stabilise themselves while traversing rapids. Georgie married her first husband, Harold Clark, in high school and had a daughter named Simona Rose when she was just 17. And after working for a bit at Radio City Music Hall, the family decided to embark on a cross-country bike trip to California. But shortly after this trip, the couple divorced. Then, in 1944, her daughter, Simona Rose, was killed in a hit-and-run while they were cycling. And then she turned to hiking after her loss, cultivating a friendship with a fellow river runner and colourful character named Harry Elson. The two then decided to float down the river, beginning at Diamond Creek and ending 60 miles down the river at Lake Mead. She began leading her river trips in the 50s and called them George's Royal River Rats, with her rafting enterprise being known mainly for its accessible and low costs, letting virtually anyone get their time on the river. She continued river running, taking her last trip before her 80th birthday. She died from cancer at the age of 81, and due to her tendency to take her customers safely lightly, which consequently led to 2 women dying in the span of her career, her legacy has since remained controversial, but that didn't stop the previously named 24-mile rapid being renamed as Georgie Rapid in the 3-2 vote, which was something that was emblematic of her polarising nature. And while we continue with the conspiracy of the Hyde's whereabouts, there is also another tale regarding the perhaps location of Glen and Bessie Hyde. During a commercial boat trip in 1971, there was an elderly woman going by the name of Liz Cutler who announced over an evening campfire that she was in fact Bessie Hyde. When a boatman called George Billingsley jokingly asked her, and I quote, "So what did you do with Glen?" With Liz Cutler, then replying, again jokingly, and again I quote,
"I killed him."
And then followed her answer by adding that she stabbed Glen, hiked out to Peach Springs in Arizona, then caught a bus back east to start a new life. However, further investigation into this Liz Cutler failed to prove that there was any link between her and the disappearances of Glen and Bessie Hyde, and furthermore, it was later established that Liz Cutler was actually a psychology professor from Ohio who liked to play mind games with other people. Probably the most intriguing detail to emerge since the Glen and Bessie Hyde's disappearance came from Emery Kolb himself, who, if you remember, was one of the Kolb brothers who ran the photography place in the Grand Canyon. You see, after Emery Kolb passed away in late 1976, in 1977 his garage was cleared out by his estate, and whilst the garage was being cleared, they came across a human skull with an obvious bullet hole. And, as you can imagine, this sent rumour control into a complete bat-out-of-hell scenario, with the initial examination determining that the skull belonged to a man in his 20s who was roughly the same height and build as Glen Hyde. However, in 2008, a forensic analysis determined that it was not the skull of Glen Hyde, as it was believed the bones showed it was too young due to the high muscle mass exhibited by the remains, with it also being determined that the skull probably belonged to a manual labourer. And on top of that, good detective work also found that Emery Kolb, before he became a photographer, had served as a county coroner jury representative for the Grand Canyon and had likely kept the skull from a different case after its inquest. So, with questions regarding the disappearance of Glen and Bessie Hyde still remaining, questions like, had they been murdered, or were they simply the victims of a bad day at the Grand Canyon, will always be asked, but until we get some answers, this case will always remain a mystery.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 151, we are going to be looking at the dark story of the Ovitz family. The Ovitz family was a family of Hungarian Jewish actors and travelling musicians originating from present Romania, who survived imprisonment at the Auschwitz concentration camp during World War II. The family of 12 ranged from a 15-month-old baby to a 58-year-old woman, and not only were they the largest family of dwarfs ever recorded, but they were also the largest family to enter Auschwitz and all survive intact.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, and proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. The pronunciations, as usual, was all mine. The actors in this episode were Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes and Denise Poolar. With special thanks to Neil Packer and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley. And a big thank you to everyone for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for Mark's Unexplained World podcast, but if you know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner that include ufology, hauntings, disasters and any other sort of paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime, unsolved crime and missing people, just drop me a direct message and I'll see what I can do. I'll also include the name of the person who suggested the idea in the end credits of the podcast, if they allow me to do so, of course. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. I thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember, guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. This show and all its contents are covered by basic copyright of Mark the Medium.